Today we will continue our studies in 1 Peter. We are going to start the last chapter, chapter 5. So if you have not done so, go ahead and open your Bibles there. I was contemplating whether or not to provide a more topical sermon, something Christmassy. But as I've done before, I promise that even though the content is not specifically about Christmas, by the end, you will have a Christmassy application. We will cover the first 7 verses of 1 Peter chapter 5. So let me go ahead and read and you can follow along. The elders who are among you, I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Peter is basically going back to the types of arguments that he was making a couple of chapters ago, chapters 2 and 3. If you remember, if you can think back, Peter would pick certain groups and he would exhort them pertaining to the relationships that God had ordained regarding natural hierarchies of the world. So, for example, Peter encouraged all of us to submit to our civil authorities, government, if you will. He also did the same thing pertaining to servants and masters. And then he talked about the relationship between husbands and wives, and also encouraged wives to submit to their husbands. And husbands also had a part in that relationship pertaining to their responsibilities. And here, again, Peter specifies his exhortations to a group of people. And he actually picks 2 groups within the church that he is focusing on these exhortations. The elders and those who he calls the young people. Who do you think that one is? Now, it's important for us to define these variables, define these terms, and there are different possibilities, but the one I believe that fits most into this context is this. Elders, the term elder literally just speaks of somebody who is old. But biblically speaking, this term evolved to a point where it described an office. Essentially, elder is a general term for a leader in the church. Somebody, again, who God chose for that purpose. Now, that term is pretty familiar. That term is pretty clear. But then, as I mentioned before, Peter also is including an exhortation on a different group. And here he calls them young people or young men, depending on the version of the Bible that you have. And most likely, Peter is not focusing on age here. He's not focusing on chronology. Essentially, he is saying, look, I have exhortations for the leaders and those who are led, for the elders and those who are the non-elders. And the reason why this is most likely what is being described here, it's because within the church, not only today, but within this period that was being covered, you had elders who were young. And the greatest example of that is of Timothy. And in Paul's letter to Timothy, who was a young elder, essentially he was assigned a very important task. Paul wrote to Timothy, encouraging him about the choosing of leadership within the church in Ephesus. But within that encouragement, Paul also added in chapter 4 of 1 Timothy that he should not let anyone despise his youth or despise him because of his youth. So there you have a perfect example of an elder who is young. So again, all of that to say that most likely Peter here, he's not focusing on chronology. He's not focusing on age. He is making a very simple dichotomy of the church, and he's saying, look, I have encouragement for the leaders and those who are led. I have encouragement for the shepherds, and I have encouragement for the flock. I have encouragement for, again, the elders and the non-elders. Now, let's take a look at the first part of this, verse 1. And Peter says, the elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Peter very adequately, he puts himself as an example of what he wanted his listeners or readers to accomplish. In other words, he included himself in the group. He says, I am writing now to elders, but I am a part of this group, which is a great tactic. Whenever you are called upon to give advice, it is good to utilize personal examples. However, even better if you can combine personal examples with biblical examples. Don't you agree? And here, essentially, this is what Peter did. He included himself in this group, and he says, I who am a fellow elder, but he also utilizes the example of another. Which is this other that he utilizes? And a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. In other words, he's saying, look, I know what it feels to be an elder. I know the blessings, and I know the heartaches. I know what you are going through, so listen to my advice because, again, I am a part of this group. However, my encouragement, my exhortation is not just based upon my example and my experience. Why? Because I'm also using another one's experience. I am a witness of this person whose glory I am also a partaker of, Jesus. So again, it is very wise, it is very adequate when, again, you are inclined to give advice for you to utilize these two examples, personal examples, but also biblical examples. Why? I don't know if you've ever been through a situation where maybe you were sharing some type of a difficulty with someone, and that person just kind of tosses a verse at you. And you know it's biblical, you know it's right, you know it is godly, but not very practical because it's just so spiritual. It may be even unattainable. Again, you don't doubt that it is right, but it is so very hard for you to digest that without any personal experience as to follow that up. But the opposite is also true. What happens when you attain advice from someone that only speaks of personal experience but does not have the backing of biblical truth? It is totally empty of authority. It may be a good example. It may be a valid point, but again, completely absent from biblical authority. But when you have both, then it becomes a truly great advice. Someone's personal experience backed by biblical truth. So again, this is what we have here. And now as we move forward on the next couple of verses, verses 2 and 4, Peter, he is, again, using this very simple dichotomy. He is just essentially splitting the church into two, the led and the leaders, but now he's speaking to the leaders, the elders. And on verse 2 and verse 4, let me read those two verses again. He says, shepherds, shepherd the flock of God, which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly. Not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but it being examples to the flock, as when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. So, elders, what must you do? You must shepherd. That's what he says here. Shepherd the flock of God. This term, shepherd, it essentially just means feeding. Feed the flock of God. And if you think about it, all of the things that can be done to sheep, this is the most important thing for animals of all sorts. But here we're talking about sheep. And I believe that Peter was actually thinking about something that he himself experienced with Christ. And I've said this before, as you read through 1 Peter and also 2 Peter, certain things that he says, it just resonates so much with his experience with Christ. And here, most likely, I believe, he is thinking about that episode after Jesus' death and resurrection where he had that encounter with Jesus. And Jesus asked him a question repeatedly. What question did Jesus ask Peter? Peter, do you love me? 3 times he asked that question. And then Peter answered every single time, yes, I love you. And Jesus, after every single response, he essentially told Peter to feed, to care, and to feed his sheep or his lamb. So again, here I think Peter is just drawing from that experience. And as he is encouraging the elders, and he's trying to just sum up the basic responsibility of an elder to the flock of God, and he says, shepherd, in other words, feed my flock. Give them the spiritual nourishment that they need, or else they will fade away and die. Now, again, I'm not an expert animal person. I keep my dog alive, but that's about it. I walk him also. But just thinking about all of the things that you could do with sheep. And I don't know if anyone has personal experience with sheep, but I'm a cuddly animal, so you could cuddle sheep. You could play with sheep. You could cut their wool or hair and knit Christmas sweaters. Again, there are many things that you could and should do with sheep, but all of those things are secondary. None of those other things that you could or even should do with sheep should take the place of your primary responsibility as a leader, which is feed the sheep. Make sure that they have the spiritual nourishment to survive. Survive on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a yearly basis, all throughout their lifetime. But not only feed the sheep with the right intentions. That is what follows here. Because he says, shepherd the flock of God, which is among you. And then he goes on to say, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly. In other words, you should not be forced to do that. You should not be coerced to do that. It should not be something like those cartoons or movies where you have a line of people and somebody asks a question and everybody steps back and you look around, you are there in front. So, okay, you must be the leader by default because no one else wants to do it. Someone and people in this position, they should be inclined to do it because they understand that they have been called for such a task and they have accepted that task and they are willing to do that. But what else? And he goes on to say, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. Dishonest gain here doesn't apply to someone wanting to steal, even though that could happen. Essentially, what Peter is saying here is that this willingness should not be based on gain. So, someone who is willing to feed the sheep, but only because they are gaining something, to God that is dishonest. They should do it eagerly. In other words, they should do it regardless of gain. Regardless of what they can attain from that. Now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't gain something or that they couldn't gain something. What it means is, essentially, if they are just doing it for the gain, from God's perspective, that is dishonest. And what else? Nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Peter mentioned here that the sheep or the flock that is being shepherded, it's God's. So when one puts himself in a position of Lord regarding their relationship to God's flock, then it is wrong. This leading, this feeding should be by example. I remember a time when my wife and I, we were traveling and we were in Germany and we stayed a few weeks at her family's house. She has a aunt that lives in Germany with her husband and her kids, her son. And I was walking around the neighborhood and it was sort of like a little German village, if you will, a rural environment. And as I was walking through the little streets with, you know, the nice German scenery, I encountered a plot of land, a fenced-in plot of land with a bunch of sheep. And there must have been 100 of them or more. And I got curious. Again, I'm not an expert. I see sheep in petting zoos and whatnot, and I guess here we have it every once in a while. But I was curious. So I approached the fence line, and as I approached the fence line, they came towards me. And I thought that was kind of neat. But then, you know, I was entertained. Took a minute, and then I started walking. And lo and behold, as I started walking, they started following. And then I started teasing them, because I went back the other way. And then they started 100 plus sheep just following me. And I went the other way, and they just started following me. Sheep love to follow. But there's another way that one can shepherd lambs or sheep. Have you ever seen sheepdogs herd sheep? What do? They're from behind, barking at them, chasing after them, threatening them. So here we have two leadership styles. One who goes in front and the sheep follow his example, and another from behind, barking, threatening, chasing. And Peter is saying, it is God's flock. You are to feed, you are to shepherd, you are to care for based on your example. Lead them. And then he says something very important. Not that these other things aren't important, but this is truly important. Verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. Now, when we're talking about the relationship of elders and non-elders, leaders and those who are led, shepherds and the flock, it is a very intense relationship. Sometimes it's a daily struggle, if you will. And we might get a sense that the relationship is just confined to those two parties. But actually what Peter is saying here is that there is a third party, and the shepherd or the elder, he does not work for the sheep. He actually works for the chief shepherd. That's who he gets his reward from. That's who assigns him this task, and that's who he should be waiting for with regards to being compensated ultimately for his duties. He's not going to get that from the sheep, even though, again, there are good sheep that make you feel good about being a shepherd. And you might get joy from that, but ultimately, the joy from that office does not come from what the sheep can give you or somehow demonstrate to you as far as their appreciation. It comes from the fact that you are hired by the chief shepherd. And he will come and evaluate your duties, your tasks, what you have done with this office, and give you your reward. And now Peter, he flips the page and he is going to address the young people or men. And again, there are different ways to interpret this, but based on context, I believe that essentially he's just utilizing this term to say, okay, elders, you're the leaders. The young people, here I'm essentially saying that you are led, regardless of age. I'm just throwing out a name out there to categorize you, very simply. And what does he tell these who are led? Likewise, you young people, submit yourself to your elders. That's it. That's all he has. Likewise is important because he is referring back to what he has already said regarding the elders. And the last thing that he said was, look, you're waiting for the chief shepherd, the main ruler, and essentially you are submitting to him. And now likewise what? Young people, those who are led, the flock, submit to your earthly elders, to your earthly shepherds. Much like they have to submit to God, you should submit to them. And then he goes on, and it's interesting because as he goes on, now he is no longer addressing these two groups distinctly. Now he is putting them all together. Because after he tells the young people to submit to their elders, he goes on to say, yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. And then he goes on to say, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Now, it is odd. Just think about this. Once again, now he is putting these groups together and he is addressing them combined. So this exhortation, this instruction is for everyone. And he says, all of you be submissive to one another. Now, how exactly does that work? We've talked about these hierarchies, these God-ordained relationships. And frankly, if you just consider the submission, they're fairly one-sided. We should submit to government. We should submit to our lords. Wives should submit to their husbands. Even though husbands do have responsibilities, the submission again is one-sided. And here, everything that he's said up until this point leads us to believe that the flock should submit to the shepherd. But now he is putting them together and he's saying, you should submit to one another. How does that make sense? Well, remember what I mentioned a few weeks ago regarding the submission that is owed within these hierarchies, these God-ordained relationships? Ultimately, even though your actions affect that other party, your submission is to God. You are submitting to God, and consequently, your actions have an effect upon these other parties, these other people. And here, this makes sense in light of that fact. Because what are you doing? We are submitting our will to God's will. Even though, at times, His will appears to benefit some more than you. Isn't that true? Think about this for a second. You are submitting your will to God's will, understanding that His will benefits some temporarily more than you, at least from a superficial evaluation. But that's what you're doing. And because you are able to do that, then you can mutually submit to one another because it is all being done first and foremost to God, and then everybody kind of benefits from this interaction. Peter also adds a verse here that he is quoting. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. He adds a notion pertaining to pride within his teachings about submission and humility. And it makes perfect sense. Why? Humility and submission, it has to do with time. Why do I say this? When we are proud, what we are saying is, I want immediate satisfaction. Isn't that true? I want to be right now. I want to be considered right now. I want satisfaction right now. Essentially, that is pride. And again, as I've stated, humility, consider God's timing, understanding that right now you may not benefit from His will, but as stated here, He may exalt you in due time. So it all has to do with timeliness. The difference between humility and pride is not benefit. The difference between humility and pride is time. You're either choosing to be right now, or you're going to choose to be right in God's time, in due time. And how can we make those choices? What encourages us to be able to refrain from our desire to have satisfaction right now, pridefully? We cast our cares to Him because we understand that He cares for us. Again, this temporary discomfort does not mean that God is not caring for us. Does not mean that He's not considering our feelings, our sorrows, our pains, even the specifics of a particular relationship. He cares for us. And because we know that he cares for us, we can cast our cares towards him. Now let's progress towards our conclusion here. And for that, I want to back up a little bit to something that Peter said in the middle of verse 5. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. Clothed with humility. In other words, girded. That's the term, girded with humility. This is another one of those incidents which I believe that Peter is thinking about, an incident that he was a part of, that he witnessed. And I believe that it is very likely that he's actually thinking about that episode when Jesus, he girded himself with a towel, with a cloth, so that he could wash the disciples' feet. And that fits perfectly into this illustration because essentially this is referring to something that a slave would do. When a slave had a particularly dirty task to do, he would disrobe himself of his regular clothes because he did not want to soil it, and he would put something like an apron. And he would do that menial dirty task. And again, it is exactly what Jesus did. Jesus is described as essentially taking his outer garments, putting it to the side, and girding himself with a towel so that he could clean the disciples' feet. And here is the illustration that he's making. Take off this outer clothing and gird and put on this humility apron. It's a dirty task. This is challenging. This is humiliating. So you need to prepare for that. But do so because Jesus did that. And think about this for a second. I just mentioned possibly what Peter is thinking of, or what he was thinking of when he worded this encouragement. But I believe that there was an occasion where this was actually even more appropriate, in an even bigger or more important way, that Jesus kind of made himself into this perfect example. Let me read to you another text. And this is where it gets Christmassy. I know you've been waiting, and here it is. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles, there's Philippians chapter 2. I'll wait for a moment. In Philippians chapter 2, look at what Paul says, starting from verse 6. Who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of man, and being found in appearance as man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Do you know what happened during Christmas? Here is God, full-fledged Almighty God, Jesus, chose to be obedient to his Father's will. Remember what I said about humility? Submit your will to God's will. Chose that, knowing that God's will temporarily may benefit others and not you. Jesus, full-fledged God, 100%, chose to put aside the privileges of his divine nature because he had a dirty task to do. He had a filthy task. He had a god-awful thing to do. So he girded himself. Did not want to blemish his divine nature. He put it to the side. And he clothed himself with what? With a human form. With a nature like our own. That deals with the realities of this fallen world that God should not experience. Yet he chose to do so. Very humbly did this. And here we are during Christmas season, right? And I've mentioned before, the lights are out, the trees are up, the presents hopefully are bought already. And our tendency is to think about Christmas during this season because it is so evident, right? It's a little cooler, not to the point where it snows. God bless Southern California, or else we couldn't be out here. But it gets a little cooler, and again, everything is just visibly Christmassy. And we think about Christmas. We think about the birth of Christ because of these things. But I think our encouragement, in addition to that, should be thinking about Christmas as this ultimate, humbling experience. Because we usually think of the joy of Christmas. Isn't that correct? The fa la 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 la, la la, la la. That's what we think of. Christmas is a joyful occasion, and it is. For whom? For us. Christmas was a humbling experience for God. Dare I say, humiliating. That's what Christmas is for God. So again, here's the encouragement. Whenever we get upset about our position in this world, think of Christmas. Think of Christmas. Whenever you get caught up with the hierarchies and the demands of stratification and you being lower than someone else, think about Christmas. Whenever you're tempted to have dissatisfaction because you want satisfaction now, pridefully, think about Christmas. Whenever you do good things for the wrong reasons, again, shepherds feed the flock, but not just for any intentions, for the right intentions. Whenever you are tempted to do good things for the wrong reasons, think about Christmas. Whenever you are tempted not to submit to these God-ordained authorities and hierarchies and relationships that we have to bear with and struggle, think about Christmas. And if we do that throughout the year, not just in December, I believe it is a great agent to motivate the humility that Peter is encouraging here. This mutual humility that, again, ultimately stems from the fact that we understand who God is and what He deserves. His will must be the one that takes charge and not our own personal and temporary will. Amen.